The first light of morning had not yet reached the wide valley of the Nile. Above the sleeping land, the sky rested in deep shades of blue, where a few fading stars still watched over the quiet fields. The river moved slowly through the darkness, carrying cool water that had traveled a long way from distant lands. Gentle waves touched the muddy banks with soft whispers that almost sounded like breathing. The villages beside the river were still asleep. Mud brick homes stood close together, their flat roofs holding the night's remaining coolness. Narrow paths between the houses were empty except for a wandering cat or the quiet steps of someone waking earlier than everyone else. A clay lamp burned low inside one small doorway, its tiny flame dancing whenever the morning breeze slipped through the cracks. Far beyond the homes, where green fields slowly gave way to endless stretches of pale desert, the air rested in complete stillness. The sand waited beneath the fading stars, smooth and untouched. At first glance, it seemed peaceful. It always seemed peaceful before sunrise. But those who had lived their entire lives beside the Nile understood something that strangers could never know. The desert was never truly asleep. It could remain silent for many days. Then, without warning, the wind would wake. Long before anyone saw the first wall of blowing sand, people learned to listen. The oldest farmers listened while standing beside their grain fields. Fishermen listened while tying their boats to wooden posts along the riverbank. Bakers listened while mixing flour before dawn. Mothers listened while sweeping dusty floors inside quiet homes. Sometimes they heard nothing except distant birds greeting the coming sun. Other mornings brought a different sound. A low murmur. Not loud. Not frightening. Only a slow movement somewhere beyond the horizon, where empty land stretched farther than anyone could walk in many days. It sounded almost like someone gently brushing thousands of tiny grains across dry stone. That soft whisper often meant the desert had begun another long journey toward the river. The people of ancient Egypt never thought of sandstorms as rare events. They were simply another part of life, as ordinary as summer heat or winter floods. Children grew up watching the sky change color beneath drifting dust. Old men remembered seasons when fine sand found its way into every basket, every blanket, every loaf of bread. No one could stop the wind. So they learned to live with it. As the first golden light slowly spread across the eastern sky, smoke began rising from clay ovens throughout the village. Women prepared flat bread before the day became too hot. They mixed flour with water inside large bowls made from fired clay. Their hands moved slowly, pressing and folding the dough with practiced rhythm. Already, a thin layer of dust rested across the wooden tables. It had settled during the night. One woman brushed it away with a woven cloth before placing fresh dough onto the smooth surface. She did not sigh. She did not complain. This happened every morning. Nearby, a little boy rubbed sleep from his eyes as he carried water from a storage jar. His bare feet left faint marks across the packed earth floor. His mother smiled softly as she covered the dough with linen cloth, hoping to keep the drifting dust away just a little longer. Outside, donkeys shifted quietly beside simple wooden fences. Their ears twitched at invisible insects. Chickens scratched the dry ground, searching patiently for seeds hidden beneath yesterday's footprints. The village slowly awakened. Voices remained soft. People greeted one another with calm familiarity. The day had only just begun. Farther along the river, fishermen prepared narrow boats carved from wood. They untied ropes, checked woven fishing nets, and pushed their boats into the calm water before the sun climbed higher into the sky. The Nile always offered relief. Its cool air carried moisture that softened the dryness coming from the desert. Even when sand drifted across the fields, the river remained patient. It flowed exactly as it had yesterday. Exactly as it would tomorrow. One elderly fisherman paused before climbing into his boat. He looked west toward the pale desert hills. The sky there seemed slightly different. Not darker. Only less clear. The horizon looked softer than usual. Almost blurred. He watched for a few quiet moments before continuing his work. There was still plenty of time before the wind arrived. If it arrived at all. Sometimes the desert only teased those who watched it. Sometimes the wind changed its mind. By mid-morning, the village had become busy. Builders repaired cracked walls using fresh mud mixed with straw. Their hands worked carefully, smoothing each surface before the heat dried it into hard brick once again. Children carried small baskets filled with reeds. Young apprentices followed experienced craftsmen through crowded workshops where wooden furniture, woven baskets, pottery, and linen cloth slowly took shape beneath steady hands. Inside one workshop, a potter sat beside his spinning wheel. The clay felt cool beneath his fingers. Outside, sunlight poured into the narrow street. Inside, shadows remained gentle. The potter hardly noticed the dust anymore. Every shelf already held tiny grains resting upon finished bowls waiting to be fired. He simply wiped each piece clean before handing it to another worker. Dust was part of the job. The same was true for scribes. Inside a government storehouse not far away, several young scribes sat cross-legged with rolls of papyrus spread before them. Small jars of ink rested nearby. One scribe carefully brushed fine sand from his writing surface before beginning another list of grain deliveries. His brush moved slowly across the papyrus. Careful. Steady. Patient. Every few minutes he stopped to remove another tiny layer of dust. No one seemed annoyed. It was simply another quiet rhythm inside the long day. Outside the building, workers carried sacks of barley beneath the warming sun. Each heavy bag rested across tired shoulders. Sweat slowly gathered across foreheads. Sand clung to damp skin more easily than dry skin. By noon, every worker wore a thin coat of pale dust. Some noticed. Most did not. The desert always left its gentle mark. As the hours passed, the wind slowly changed. It remained light. Almost pleasant. Yet it carried something different. People smelled dry earth before they saw anything unusual. The breeze no longer felt cool from the river. Instead, it carried warmth from distant empty lands. A merchant leading 2 donkeys paused beside the road. He narrowed his eyes toward the western horizon. The line separating earth from sky had almost disappeared. Everything beyond the hills seemed wrapped inside a pale golden veil. Travelers understood these signs well. Many had spent entire days walking through blowing sand. They knew when to keep moving. They also knew when to stop. The merchant quietly changed his plans. Instead of continuing toward another village, he guided his animals back toward home. There would be another day for trading. Today belonged to the wind. Throughout ancient Egypt, thousands of similar decisions quietly unfolded. Farmers gathered tools earlier than expected. Builders covered unfinished work with woven mats. Boat owners secured ropes more tightly. Market sellers placed cloth over baskets of vegetables and dried fish. Nobody hurried. There was no panic. Only preparation. Because everyone understood that fighting the desert accomplished nothing. Living beside it required patience. An old grandmother sat beneath the shade of a date palm while weaving reeds into baskets. She glanced toward the changing sky but never stopped weaving. Her fingers had performed the same movements for more than 50 years. She remembered sandstorms from childhood. She remembered storms that lasted only one afternoon. Others had lasted several days. The desert always chose its own schedule. Children continued playing nearby, drawing shapes into dusty ground with small sticks. One little girl looked toward the horizon and asked her grandmother whether another storm was coming. The old woman smiled. Perhaps. That was all she said. Because no one truly knew. As afternoon sunlight softened slightly, birds began flying lower across the fields. Many settled inside reeds growing beside the Nile instead of remaining in open skies. Goats wandered closer to shelters. Dogs rested beneath walls where shade remained thick. Even animals seemed to understand the language of changing wind. By now, the western sky carried a gentle bronze color. Not beautiful. Not ugly. Simply different. Fine dust floated high above the land where sunlight caught each tiny grain. The air itself appeared heavier. People spoke more quietly without realizing it. There is something about waiting that naturally lowers the human voice. Perhaps it has always been that way. A baker removed fresh loaves from his clay oven. Their warm smell filled the narrow street. Neighbors smiled as they passed. Bread remained one of life's simple comforts. Even when sand covered everything else, warm bread still tasted familiar. Inside homes throughout the village, families began closing shutters made from woven reeds. Doorways were covered with hanging cloth. Storage jars received tight lids. Water containers were checked carefully. Parents reminded children not to wander far. Not because the coming storm was dangerous every time, but because blowing sand could easily hide familiar paths. As the afternoon continued, the first stronger gust arrived. It swept gently through the village. Loose straw rolled across dusty streets. Palm leaves rustled overhead. A few chickens hurried beneath nearby carts. Fine grains of sand tapped softly against mud brick walls. The sound was almost delicate. Like dry rain. Everyone paused. Only for a moment. Then work continued. The wind had introduced itself. Nothing more. An elderly builder stood atop a low wall repairing cracked plaster. He climbed down slowly before gathering his tools. No one asked why. They already knew. By evening, the storm might become stronger. Or it might not. Still, there was little reason to remain outside longer than necessary. The rhythm of the village gently shifted toward home. Women finished collecting laundry drying beneath the afternoon sun. Children carried baskets indoors. Donkeys received extra bundles of hay. Boats returned earlier than usual from quiet fishing waters. The Nile reflected the changing sky in long streaks of pale gold. Its calm surface seemed untouched by the distant desert. Yet everyone knew that even the river would soon feel the storm. Not beneath its water, but above it. The first real curtain of sand appeared far away. At first it looked like a low cloud resting upon the earth. Then it slowly grew taller. Wider. Closer. No one ran. No one shouted. The village simply settled into itself. Doors closed. Voices softened. Clay lamps waited for darkness. And the ancient people who had shared their lives with both river and desert prepared once again for another quiet meeting with the wind. The sand had traveled for many miles before reaching them. Soon it would pass through every narrow street. It would rest upon every rooftop. It would slip beneath every doorway. And tomorrow morning, before sunrise, someone would gently brush it away and begin another ordinary day beside the patient waters of the Nile. The first edge of the sandstorm reached the village with little ceremony. There was no sudden roar. No sharp beginning that everyone noticed at once. Instead, the afternoon light slowly became softer, as though a thin linen cloth had been stretched across the sky. Shadows lost their sharp edges. Bright colors became pale. The familiar green fields beside the Nile seemed quieter beneath the drifting veil of dust. A warm breeze wandered through the narrow streets. It carried thousands upon thousands of tiny grains that had rested for many years upon distant hills. Some had once lain beside forgotten roads where travelers no longer walked. Others had slept between dry stones beneath lonely cliffs where only desert birds landed. Now they floated together through the air, beginning another slow journey across the valley. Inside one small home, a family finished preparing the evening meal before the wind grew stronger. The mother lifted a heavy clay lid from a cooking pot. Steam rose gently into the room, carrying the comforting smell of lentils, onions, and fresh herbs gathered earlier that morning. Beside the pot rested warm flatbread wrapped carefully in woven cloth to protect it from the dust that seemed determined to settle on everything. Her oldest daughter carefully swept the floor one final time. She knew it would not remain clean for long. Still, sweeping was part of the evening routine. The simple movement of the reed broom across the packed earth floor brought a quiet sense of order. The fine dust gathered into small piles near the doorway before being carried outside. Only moments later, another thin layer drifted back inside. No one seemed surprised. Across the room, the father gently fastened a woven mat across the doorway. It would not stop the smallest grains, but it slowed them enough to make the room feel calmer. Tiny threads of sunlight slipped through the gaps, filling the air with narrow beams where floating dust sparkled like countless tiny stars. Their youngest son sat quietly watching those little grains dance through the light. He reached out with both hands, trying to catch them. Each time they slipped away. He smiled softly and tried again. Outside, the village had become noticeably quieter. The market, usually filled with the sounds of trading and conversation until sunset, had begun closing much earlier than usual. Merchants wrapped linen around baskets of figs, onions, and dried fish before carrying them indoors. Wooden stalls stood empty. Loose fabric fluttered gently in the growing wind. A potter carefully covered rows of newly shaped bowls with woven baskets. Wet clay was especially vulnerable during a sandstorm. Too much dust settling into the soft surface could leave tiny marks that remained forever after firing. He examined each piece slowly. His hands moved with great care. The bowls represented many days of patient work. He whispered a quiet hope that the coverings would be enough. Nearby, a young apprentice gathered scattered tools left outside the workshop. Small wooden carving knives, bundles of reeds, smooth polishing stones, and clay molds disappeared one by one into storage chests. His teacher smiled with quiet approval. No instructions were necessary. Every apprentice eventually learned how quickly a peaceful afternoon could change when the desert wind decided to visit. Along the riverbank, fishermen had already secured their boats. The Nile itself remained calm. Its gentle current continued flowing north, as steady as it had for countless generations. The water did not hurry. It did not resist the wind. It simply continued its patient journey. A fisherman sat beside his tide boat, watching the changing sky. His weathered hands rested comfortably upon his knees. He had spent nearly 60 years beside this river. He knew every season, every flood, every harvest, every familiar sound of water moving against wood. The approaching sandstorm no longer filled him with concern. Instead, it reminded him how closely every life beside the Nile depended upon forces no one could control. Floods arrived. Heat arrived. Cool evenings arrived. And the sand always returned. He watched small waves form beneath the strengthening breeze. The river carried reflections of the pale sky, now filled with drifting dust that softened the afternoon sun into a gentle golden circle. It almost looked like the moon. Children no longer played beside the paths. Most had been called inside by parents and grandparents. The narrow streets belonged once again to adults finishing the final tasks of the day. One elderly woman hurried carefully toward her neighbor's house carrying a basket covered with linen. Inside rested fresh bread. She smiled as she knocked gently upon the wooden door. The family inside welcomed her with quiet gratitude. Sharing food during a sandstorm was common. If someone had difficulty baking that day, another household often prepared enough for everyone nearby. Such kindness did not require discussion. It had simply become part of village life over many generations. The wind carried more dust now. Small streams of sand slipped around corners, gathering in familiar places beneath walls and beside doorways. Each little pile would grow larger before morning. Every household owned simple wooden scoops or reed brooms ready for tomorrow's cleaning. Nobody expected the village to remain untouched. That expectation would only bring disappointment. Instead, people accepted the changing landscape with quiet patience. A group of builders sat together beneath the shelter of a large unfinished wall. Their day's work had ended earlier than planned. The fresh mud plaster would dry on its own. There was little more they could safely accomplish before the storm strengthened. One worker stretched his tired legs. Another rubbed sore shoulders after carrying heavy stones since sunrise. Their muscles welcomed the unexpected rest. The desert wind, although inconvenient, sometimes offered something valuable. It reminded people that even the strongest hands needed moments of stillness. One man removed his sandals and gently shook out the sand already collected inside them. Tiny grains poured onto the ground. He smiled quietly. Within an hour, they would be full again. His companions laughed softly. Not because it was amusing. Because it was familiar. Every worker understood the endless friendship between sandals and sand. As evening slowly approached, the sunlight grew dimmer. Not because the sun had reached the horizon. The storm itself filtered the light. Fields of barley appeared almost silver beneath the dusty sky. Palm trees swayed gently. Their long leaves whispered together high above the village. Even the birds seemed quieter now. Many had disappeared into thick reeds along the riverbank or hidden among dense branches where they waited patiently for calmer air. The livestock sensed the change as well. Goats gathered closely together beneath simple shelters. Oxen stood with lowered heads, their broad backs slowly collecting fine dust. Donkeys blinked often against the blowing sand but remained calm. Animals who spent their lives beside the Nile knew this rhythm just as well as the people. Inside another home, an elderly scribe sat beside a small oil lamp. The room remained peaceful despite the growing wind outside. Rolls of papyrus rested neatly upon wooden shelves. His writing brushes lay beside carefully prepared jars of black and red ink. He unrolled a fresh sheet. Before beginning, he gently brushed away a thin layer of dust. Only then did he dip the brush into dark ink. His handwriting remained steady despite his age. Each careful line recorded grain deliveries from nearby farms. Simple records. Ordinary accounts. The quiet work that helped villages continue from one season into the next. Occasionally, a stronger gust rattled the woven mat covering the doorway. Tiny grains slipped through anyway. The scribe paused, smiled gently, then brushed them away once more. He had repeated this simple act thousands of times throughout his life. It no longer interrupted his thoughts. It had become another rhythm inside the slow passage of each day. Beyond the village, travelers still walking the dusty roads searched for shelter before darkness. Some found small farming settlements willing to offer a place beside the fire. Others stopped beneath rocky hills where natural ledges broke the strongest winds. One merchant leading 3 donkeys spotted an abandoned storage building near an irrigation canal. Its thick mud brick walls still stood strong despite many years beneath the desert sun. He guided the animals inside. There they waited together. The donkeys lowered their heads as warm winds swept through the empty doorway. The merchant offered each animal fresh water before sitting quietly against the cool wall. Outside, the storm slowly gathered its strength. Inside, the air remained calm enough for rest. As twilight approached, lamps began glowing throughout the village. Their small flames filled windows with warm golden light. From outside, the homes resembled quiet stars scattered across the dusty earth. Families gathered together for the evening meal. Conversation remained gentle. Children spoke softly. Older relatives shared memories of storms from many years before. One grandfather remembered a season when sand covered the roads so deeply that familiar landmarks almost disappeared. Another recalled waking to find tiny dunes gathered against every doorway in the village. The children listened with wide eyes. Not because the stories frightened them. Because they painted pictures of a world that always changed, even when the people themselves remained rooted beside the river. The warm meal brought comfort. Fresh bread was broken into smaller pieces. Bowls of beans, vegetables, and onions passed from hand to hand. Cool water eased the dryness left by blowing dust. Every now and then someone paused to wipe fine grains from the rim of a bowl. No one complained. The meal continued peacefully. Outside, the wind continued its patient work. Dust slipped over rooftops. It drifted through narrow alleys. It settled gently upon sleeping gardens where onions, garlic, and herbs waited for another sunrise. Palm leaves rustled with slow, steady movements. Somewhere beyond the village, unseen among the darkening fields, a shepherd guided the last of his sheep into a stone enclosure. The animals crowded together for warmth and shelter. The shepherd closed the wooden gate and looked toward the fading light. The western horizon had completely disappeared. Only a soft wall of dusty sky remained. Night arrived gradually. The storm hid the first stars. Usually, families could step outside after sunset and watch countless lights fill the heavens above the Nile. Tonight the sky remained quiet. The stars waited behind drifting sand. Even the moon appeared only as a faint glowing circle behind the dusty air. Inside their homes, people settled into familiar evening routines. Mothers folded linen blankets. Children yawned after the long day. Clay lamps burned steadily, their small flames protected from the wind by thick walls. The rooms felt warm. The smell of baked bread still lingered. Some families spoke quietly before sleep. Others simply enjoyed the peaceful silence together. Outside, footsteps became rare. Only a few late travelers moved carefully through the village. Each step stirred small clouds of dust already gathered along the paths. Sand whispered across stone. Wind brushed gently against walls. Far away, the Nile continued flowing through the darkness, carrying cool water beneath a sky almost hidden from view. The river never stopped. The wind never stayed forever. Both had shaped this land since long before the oldest stories were first spoken. And within the quiet shelter of their mud brick homes, the people of ancient Egypt rested calmly, knowing that by morning they would wake to another landscape gently rearranged by the patient hands of the desert wind. Night settled fully across the Nile Valley, though it felt different from most nights. The stars were still there above the drifting sand, but only a few faint points of light managed to shine through the dusty sky. The moon appeared as a soft white circle wrapped behind a thin curtain, its gentle glow spreading evenly across the land instead of casting bright shadows. The wind continued its slow conversation with the village. It slipped around corners. It brushed against mud brick walls. It carried fine grains of sand across rooftops and through narrow lanes that only hours earlier had been filled with workers returning home. Now those same paths rested in silence. Only the sound of the wind remained. Inside one small house near the edge of the fields, a family prepared for sleep. Their evening meal had ended not long before. Clay bowls had been rinsed with precious water and turned upside down upon a wooden shelf. A woven basket protected the remaining bread for tomorrow morning. The small cooking fire had been covered so that only a few glowing coals remained beneath the ashes. The mother checked the doorway one final time. The woven reed mat still hung securely. Tiny grains of sand had already gathered along its bottom edge. She brushed them away with the side of her hand before spreading sleeping mats across the floor. The children lay down first. Their long day of carrying water, helping with chores, and running through dusty streets had left them pleasantly tired. The youngest child listened to the wind outside. "What is the desert saying?" he whispered. His grandmother smiled in the dim light. "It is only passing by." The answer seemed enough. Within moments, the child closed his eyes. His breathing became slow and steady. The grandmother remained awake for a little while longer. She had spent more than 70 years beside the Nile. There had been countless evenings just like this one. Each storm had sounded a little different. Some winds arrived gently and departed before dawn. Others stayed for several days, filling every corner of the village with pale dust. Yet somehow, life always settled back into its familiar rhythm. She closed her eyes, listening not only to the wind but also to the peaceful sounds inside the room. The quiet breathing of sleeping grandchildren. The gentle crackle of cooling clay near the hearth. The soft rustle of linen blankets whenever someone turned in their sleep. These sounds felt just as familiar as the storm itself. Farther along the village, another family had not yet gone to bed. Their oldest daughter carefully mended a linen garment beside a small oil lamp. Her needle moved patiently through the cloth. Each stitch was almost identical to the last. She worked without hurry. There would always be another tear to repair. Another piece of clothing to strengthen before it wore thin. The wind outside rattled the shutters. A few grains of sand slipped through tiny openings in the wall. They landed silently upon the floor. The young woman smiled softly. Tomorrow morning she would sweep them away. That thought never troubled her. It simply belonged to tomorrow. Her father sat nearby carving a small wooden handle for one of his farming tools. The sharp knife moved slowly across the smooth wood. Tiny curls fell into his lap. Every so often he paused to listen. The wind seemed slightly stronger now. Not fierce. Only steadier. It moved with quiet confidence across the valley. Beyond the village, the fields rested beneath the dusty night. The young barley bent gently beneath the passing air. Palm trees swayed in slow, graceful movements. The irrigation channels reflected only faint hints of moonlight. Water continued flowing quietly through carefully dug canals that generations of farmers had maintained with patient hands. The storm could cover the fields with dust. It could never stop the water. That steady flow had shaped every season of Egyptian life. Long before sunrise, farmers would once again open small channels, guide water toward thirsty crops, and inspect the condition of their fields. Even after a sandstorm, those routines rarely changed. The Nile always called them back to work. Not far away, a fisherman remained awake inside his simple riverside shelter. He preferred sleeping close to his boat whenever possible. The familiar smell of damp reeds, river mud, and wet rope had become comforting over the years. Outside, the storm softened the sounds usually carried across the water. On clear nights he often heard frogs calling from distant marshes. Sometimes fish splashed quietly beneath the moon. Tonight the wind wrapped every sound inside a gentle blanket of moving dust. He leaned against the doorway and watched the river. The water itself seemed untouched. Only the air above it had changed. The fisherman thought about tomorrow's journey. If the storm weakened before dawn, he would set out as usual. If it continued, he would wait. The river had taught him patience. Fish could always be caught another day. Nearby, several boats rocked gently against their wooden posts. Their ropes creaked softly. Each movement matched the slow rhythm of the wind. Nothing hurried. Nothing resisted. The boat simply accepted each small push from the breeze. Much like the people themselves. Elsewhere, beyond the cultivated fields, the desert stretched endlessly beneath the dusty sky. The storm had gathered countless grains from distant places. Some sand had traveled across open plains where almost nothing grew. Some had drifted over forgotten paths once used by traders many years before. Some had rested among ancient stone outcrops where desert foxes quietly searched for shelter. Now every grain continued its patient journey. The wind asked for nothing. It simply carried the land from one place to another. Inside a larger farming village farther south, several workers shared a common sleeping room. Their day had begun before sunrise with repairing irrigation dikes damaged during the previous flood season. The work had been heavy. Mud clung to their legs through most of the morning. By afternoon, drying wind had covered them with fine dust. Now they rested upon woven mats spread across the floor. Most had fallen asleep almost immediately after eating. One young worker remained awake. His shoulders still ached from lifting heavy baskets filled with wet earth. He stretched carefully before settling onto his blanket. Outside, he could hear sand brushing across the roof. The sound reminded him of water gently flowing through reeds. It was strangely comforting. He had listened to that same sound since childhood. His father had listened before him. His grandfather before that. Some sounds become so familiar that they feel like part of home. Across the valley, temple guards quietly continued their nightly watch. Their duty changed little because of the weather. They walked slowly beneath covered entrances where tall stone columns sheltered them from much of the drifting sand. Oil lamps burned steadily inside protected alcoves. The warm light reflected softly from carved walls covered with carefully painted figures. Even here, inside great temples built from massive stone blocks, the desert found its way indoors. A thin layer of dust settled gently upon the floor each day. Priests and attendants swept it away each morning before the first prayers. The task never truly ended. No one expected it to. The desert was patient. The people were patient as well. Within one quiet chamber, an elderly priest carefully covered sacred scrolls with linen cloth before retiring for the night. He knew the storm would leave its gentle mark by morning. A little extra care now would preserve the writings for many years. His movements were slow and thoughtful. He extinguished one lamp after another until only a single flame remained near the doorway. The temple gradually entered silence. Only the wind continued speaking outside. In another part of the valley, a merchant caravan had chosen to remain where it had found shelter earlier that afternoon. The travelers shared dried dates, bread, and cool water before settling down to rest. Their donkeys stood calmly nearby, occasionally shaking dust from their ears. One young merchant stepped outside the shelter for a moment. He looked toward the hidden stars. Although he could see very little, he smiled. He knew the heavens remained above the storm exactly as they always had. Sometimes clouds hid them. Sometimes dust hid them. Yet they remained unchanged. That quiet thought brought him peace. He returned inside, wrapped himself in a wool blanket, and soon drifted into sleep. The night grew deeper. The wind no longer increased. Instead, it settled into a steady rhythm. It no longer felt like a visitor arriving. It had become part of the darkness itself. Throughout hundreds of villages scattered along the Nile, thousands of people slept while the storm slowly reshaped the surface of the land. Tiny dunes formed beside walls. Footprints disappeared beneath fresh layers of sand. Roads became slightly softer. Courtyards collected pale drifts in their corners. Palm leaves gathered dust that would later wash away with morning dew. Inside kitchens, the scent of baked bread lingered. Inside workshops, unfinished tools waited quietly for the return of daylight. Inside storehouses, baskets of grain rested beneath carefully tied coverings. Every home held its own small silence. Time seemed almost slower during nights like these. Even the hours felt wrapped inside the drifting sand. Eventually, somewhere far to the east, darkness began its gradual retreat. The first hint of dawn was almost impossible to notice. The sky did not suddenly brighten. Instead, it slowly changed from deep blue to gentle gray. The dusty air softened every color. The wind continued blowing, though now it seemed less determined than before. Its long journey was beginning to tire. A rooster called from somewhere inside the village. Another answered from farther away. The sounds traveled only a short distance before being swallowed by the dusty morning. Inside the homes, a few people stirred beneath their blankets. The oldest members of each household often woke first. Years of routine guided them more faithfully than any clock ever could. One elderly woman quietly sat up. She folded her blanket with practiced care. Before opening the door, she paused. She could already imagine what waited outside. A fresh layer of sand upon the threshold. Dust across the courtyard. Palm leaves resting beneath pale grains carried from the western desert. None of it surprised her. She gently lifted the reed mat from the doorway. The morning air entered the room. It felt cool for only a brief moment before the warmth of the coming day would return. Outside, the village appeared softer than yesterday. Every edge had been gently rounded by the night's work. The paths looked smoother. The walls seemed lighter. Even familiar footprints had disappeared. It was as though the desert had quietly borrowed the village during the night, rearranging it with patient hands before giving it back at dawn. The old woman smiled to herself. She reached for her reed broom. Its worn handle fit comfortably into her hand. With slow, steady strokes, she began sweeping away the sand that had gathered outside her home. Across the village, hundreds of other brooms began making the very same quiet sound. Soft brushing. Patient movement. A familiar rhythm that greeted another peaceful morning beside the timeless waters of the Nile. The gentle sound of sweeping spread through the village before the sun had fully risen. It was one of the first sounds of nearly every morning, but after a sandstorm it became the quiet song that welcomed a new day. Reed brooms brushed against packed earth. Wooden scoops lifted small drifts of sand from doorways. Clay pots were carefully uncovered, dusted clean, and returned to their usual places. No one rushed. The work was slow, steady, and almost peaceful. The cool air before sunrise made these first chores feel lighter than they would only a few hours later. A faint breeze still wandered through the streets, carrying the last tired whispers of the storm. It no longer pushed great clouds of dust through the valley. Instead, it moved gently, as though satisfied with everything it had already done. The eastern horizon slowly brightened. Soft bands of pale gold appeared above the distant hills. The first sunlight reached the highest leaves of the date palms. Moments later, it touched the flat rooftops of the village. The warmth arrived little by little. An old farmer stepped outside carrying a clay jar filled with water. Before drinking, he looked quietly across the village. Every roof wore a thin blanket of sand. The corners of every courtyard held small pale mounds. Even the narrow paths between the homes seemed smoother than they had yesterday. He smiled to himself. The desert had visited once again. He poured a little water into his hands and gently washed the dust from his face. The coolness lingered for only a moment before the growing warmth of the morning began drying his skin. Nearby, his wife opened the wooden storage chest where grain was kept. Before removing anything, she wiped the lid carefully with a damp cloth. A fine layer of dust had settled there during the night despite every effort to keep the house closed. She worked patiently. The cloth became sandy. She rinsed it in a small bowl of water. Then she cleaned the surface once more. This routine had become as familiar to her as baking bread itself. Across the lane, another family climbed onto their roof. Flat roofs served many purposes in ancient Egypt. People dried grain there. They repaired baskets. They rested during cooler evenings. After every sandstorm, they also became places for careful cleaning. Two brothers used woven brushes to sweep the roof from one side to the other. Small streams of sand slipped over the edge, falling silently into the street below. The younger brother laughed quietly as a little cloud rose around his feet. His older brother smiled but kept working. There was still much to do before breakfast. Below them, chickens wandered through the fresh sand, leaving delicate footprints behind. Each tiny mark remained clear until another breeze gently softened its edges. The village looked almost new. The old roads had not changed. The homes had not moved. Yet everything appeared slightly different beneath the fresh covering of desert sand. At the village well, several women gathered with large clay jars balanced upon their shoulders. The morning conversations were calm and unhurried. They spoke softly about the storm. One woman mentioned that sand had drifted beneath her doorway despite hanging two heavy reed mats. Another smiled and replied that the desert always seemed to find the smallest opening. The others nodded. Everyone understood. No house was ever completely closed against the wind. As each woman lowered her jar into the cool water, tiny grains of sand still clung to the rope. The buckets rose dripping with clear water. The water itself remained fresh. The Nile had not changed. Only the world around it had received a new layer of the desert. A little farther away, children helped their parents clean the family courtyard. The youngest carried tiny baskets that were only half full. They proudly emptied each basket outside the village wall where the sand joined countless older piles left from storms long forgotten. The work felt important to them. Every child learned these simple tasks from an early age. Not because anyone demanded perfection, but because caring for the home was simply part of life beside the Nile. A grandmother sat beneath the shade of a sycamore tree, shaking dust from woven sleeping mats. Each gentle strike released another small cloud into the morning air. Sunlight caught the floating grains. For a moment they shimmered like tiny pieces of gold before settling quietly back to the earth. She smiled as she worked. The mats had served her family for many years. The sand never harmed them. It only reminded her that everything needed care. Inside the baker's small courtyard, the clay oven had survived the storm without trouble. The baker brushed sand from its rounded top before gathering dry reeds for the morning fire. Soon thin streams of smoke rose once again into the brightening sky. The familiar smell of fresh bread slowly spread through the village. Warm flour, yeast, wood smoke. These comforting scents mixed gently with the dry smell of fresh sand. People passing along the road breathed deeply. Some smiled without thinking. Bread meant another ordinary day had begun. The baker's young assistant carefully sifted flour through a woven screen. A few tiny grains of sand remained mixed among it. He removed them patiently. The process took time. No one expected it to be quick. The baker had taught him long ago that good bread required calm hands. Haste belonged nowhere near the oven. Across the village, craftsmen slowly returned to their workshops. The potter uncovered his drying bowls. He examined each one carefully. A little dust had settled upon the soft clay, but not enough to ruin the work. Using a damp cloth, he gently smoothed each surface. His fingers knew exactly how much pressure to use. Too much would leave marks. Too little would leave the dust behind. Years of practice guided every movement. His apprentice watched closely. One day these careful habits would become his own. Nearby, a carpenter opened the wooden shutters of his workshop. Sunlight entered the room in long golden lines. It revealed countless tiny grains floating quietly through the air. The carpenter simply waited. He knew that opening the room too quickly after a storm stirred even more dust. Instead, he sat on a low stool and allowed the air to settle. Patience often saved work that rushing could spoil. When the light finally became clear enough, he began brushing each tool clean. Wooden mallets, bronze chisels, measuring cords, smooth polishing stones. Every tool deserved attention before the day's work resumed. Nothing was ignored. Even the smallest knife received the same careful cleaning as the largest saw. Beyond the workshops, farmers walked toward their fields. Each carried familiar tools across their shoulders. Wooden hoes, simple baskets, bundles of rope. As they reached the edges of the cultivated land, they paused. The storm had left a thin covering of sand across the rich dark soil. The crops still stood. The irrigation channels still flowed. Only the surface had changed. The oldest farmer knelt and picked up a handful of earth. He rubbed it slowly between his fingers. Beneath the pale dust lay the fertile black soil brought each year by the Nile floods. He smiled. The fields remained healthy. The desert had only borrowed them for one night. Soon careful work would return everything to its proper place. The farmers spread out quietly. Some cleared sand from narrow irrigation channels where drifting grains had begun blocking the gentle flow of water. Others inspected young plants one by one. They straightened bent stalks, removed dry leaves, checked roots hidden beneath the soil. Their work required close attention rather than great strength. The morning passed peacefully. The sound of water moving through canals mixed with the gentle scrape of wooden tools. Birds slowly returned to the fields. Small white egrets landed beside the irrigation ditches, searching patiently for insects stirred by the workers' footsteps. A pair of ibis glided low over the marshes before disappearing into tall reeds. The village cats emerged from shaded corners, stretching lazily beneath the warming sun. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. The storm had interrupted nothing for very long. At the riverbank, fishermen inspected their boats before leaving. Fine sand covered the wooden seats inside each vessel. One man used a bundle of reeds to sweep everything into the water. The current carried the dust away without effort. He checked his fishing net next. Tiny grains had become tangled among the cords. Patiently, he shook them free. The net would soon disappear beneath cool river water where no trace of the storm remained. The Nile accepted everything quietly. It asked no questions. It simply carried water northward day after day. As the sun climbed higher, warmth slowly spread across the valley. The cool freshness of dawn began fading. Workers tied linen cloth around their heads to soften the growing heat. Sweat soon appeared upon foreheads. Dust once again clung to damp skin. Although the storm had passed, the desert remained close. Its fine sand still rested upon every surface. Each passing breeze lifted a little into the air again. Not enough to trouble anyone. Only enough to remind the people that the desert never truly left. An elderly scribe walked slowly toward the village storehouse carrying a fresh roll of papyrus beneath his arm. His sandals left clear prints in the smooth sand covering the road. He noticed how different the familiar path looked after every storm. Yesterday's footprints had vanished completely. Cart tracks had disappeared. Even the wandering dogs had left no sign of their nighttime journeys. Every storm quietly erased the small stories written upon the ground. Each morning began with clean pages. The scribe liked that thought. Perhaps the earth itself enjoyed beginning again. He entered the cool storehouse. Inside, the thick mud brick walls protected the room from the strengthening heat. Dust had gathered upon the shelves during the night. Before unrolling his papyrus, he carefully wiped his writing table with a damp cloth. Then he sat cross-legged in the familiar silence. He dipped his brush into black ink. Outside, workers carried grain. Inside, only the gentle scratching of the brush disturbed the stillness. He wrote slowly. Every number. Every name. Every measure of barley. Each careful line would remain long after the footprints outside had disappeared beneath another drifting layer of sand. The morning continued unfolding with the same quiet rhythm that had guided countless generations before. The wind had come. The wind had gone. Yet the people beside the Nile understood something deeper than the passing storm. Life was not shaped by avoiding the desert. It was shaped by meeting it again and again with patient hands, calm hearts, and familiar routines that turned even the drifting sand into another ordinary part of the day. As the morning slowly unfolded into the warmth of late day, the last traces of the night's cool air quietly disappeared from the valley. The sun climbed higher above the eastern horizon, pouring gentle light across the Nile until the river shimmered like polished bronze. The calm water reflected the pale blue sky, while small ripples carried the images of passing birds toward the north. The village had fully awakened. The sounds of work returned one by one. A wooden mallet tapped steadily inside a carpenter's workshop. A potter's wheel turned with its familiar quiet rhythm. Someone called softly to a pair of oxen beginning another day in the fields. Children carried baskets that seemed almost too large for their small hands, yet they walked proudly beside their parents, eager to help with whatever simple task awaited them. Although the sandstorm had passed, its quiet presence remained everywhere. A thin layer of pale dust still rested along the edges of windows. Fresh footprints covered the paths where yesterday every mark had vanished. Small dunes leaned gently against courtyard walls, as though the desert had paused to rest before continuing its endless journey. No one hurried to remove every grain. There was no need. The people understood that some of the sand would remain until the next breeze carried it elsewhere. Near the center of the village, an elderly basket maker sat beneath a woven shade stretched between two wooden poles. The shade softened the growing sunlight without completely hiding it. Golden patches of light slipped through tiny openings in the woven reeds, moving slowly across the ground as the sun climbed higher. His hands moved with quiet confidence. Fresh reeds soaked in water lay beside him inside a shallow clay basin. Each reed felt cool and flexible. He bent one gently around another, slowly shaping the walls of a new basket. Now and then, he paused to brush away a little sand that had settled across his work. He never brushed roughly. The motion was light, almost affectionate. The basket would carry grain one day. Perhaps onions. Perhaps figs gathered during harvest. It deserved careful hands from the very beginning. Across the lane, a young girl carried a small clay jar toward the well. She walked slowly, careful not to stumble over the uneven ground. Her sandals pressed neat shapes into the fresh sand. She enjoyed watching her footprints appear behind her. Sometimes she looked back to admire the line they formed. She knew they would disappear sooner or later. Another breeze would soften them. Another storm would erase them completely. Still, for this quiet morning, they belonged to her alone. At the well, several older women were already drawing water. The thick rope creaked softly as another bucket disappeared into the cool darkness below. The sound echoed gently against the stone lining. Moments later the bucket returned, shining with clear water. Tiny droplets fell back into the well, creating soft circles upon the surface below. One woman dipped her hand into the bucket before pouring the water into her jar. The coolness lingered upon her fingers. She smiled quietly. Even during the hottest months, the first touch of cool water each morning brought a simple kind of happiness. Conversation flowed gently among the women. No voices were loud. There was no reason to hurry. One spoke of her son's new work helping repair irrigation canals. Another mentioned that her youngest daughter had learned to grind grain without spilling flour across the floor. A third laughed softly as she described how one stubborn goat had hidden beneath the family bed during the sandstorm instead of staying inside its shelter. The others smiled. Such small stories traveled through every village beside the Nile. They were carried as naturally as water itself. Beyond the houses, the farmers continued their patient work. The irrigation canals required careful attention after every storm. Fine sand often gathered where the water entered the fields, slowing its gentle flow. A father and his two sons knelt beside one narrow channel. Using simple wooden scoops, they lifted the pale sand onto the nearby bank. The work demanded patience rather than strength. Each scoop uncovered another little stream of water. Soon the canal flowed freely again. The water slipped quietly between rows of young barley. The plants seemed almost grateful. Tiny leaves lifted toward the sunlight. The oldest son watched the water carefully. His father noticed. "Always look where the water wishes to go," he said softly. "It will show you where help is needed." The boy nodded. He would remember those words for many years. Not because they sounded important. Because they proved true every season. The Nile always revealed what careful eyes were willing to see. Nearby, a flock of white birds followed the workers. As insects emerged from the damp soil, the birds stepped gracefully through the fields, finding breakfast with patient precision. Their bright feathers stood out against the dark earth. Every now and then one spread its wings before settling again only a few steps away. The farmers hardly noticed. Birds had shared these fields with them for generations. The quiet companionship felt perfectly natural. Closer to the river, fishermen untangled their nets beneath the shade of tall palms. The nets had collected bits of drifting sand during yesterday's storm. Each knot was examined carefully. Every loose thread was repaired before the boats returned to the water. A torn net could mean an empty meal. A strong net could feed several families. One elderly fisherman worked more slowly than the others. His hands had become stiff over the years. Even so, every knot he tied remained strong. Young fishermen often came to watch him. He rarely explained his methods. He simply worked. The lessons were found in watching patient hands repeat familiar movements without waste. When his net was finally ready, he folded it neatly across the bow of his narrow boat. The wood beneath his fingers felt warm already. Soon the sun would make it almost too hot to touch. That was another reason fishermen preferred beginning their work early. The morning hours belonged to comfort. The afternoon belonged to endurance. Along one dusty road leading away from the village, a merchant prepared to continue his journey. Yesterday he had wisely turned back when the approaching storm appeared upon the western horizon. Today the road looked different. Fresh sand covered many familiar wheel tracks. Some landmarks seemed smaller beneath the drifting dunes. Still, the merchant recognized the path. He adjusted the bundles tied across his donkeys. Each package held carefully woven linen destined for another settlement several days away. The animals stood quietly while he checked every knot. A loose rope could become troublesome during a long journey. Satisfied, he placed a gentle hand upon the neck of the lead donkey. Together they began walking beneath the warming sun. Their footprints stretched slowly behind them. Far ahead, the desert shimmered gently. The road seemed to disappear into the pale distance. Inside the village school, several young scribes sat cross-legged upon woven mats. Their teacher unrolled fresh sheets of papyrus. The room smelled faintly of reed pens, ink, and dry linen. Sunlight entered through narrow openings high in the wall, filling the room with soft golden beams. Tiny grains of dust floated lazily through the light. The students hardly noticed. One by one, they dipped their brushes into black ink. The teacher spoke calmly. "Write slowly." The children lowered their eyes. Brushes touched papyrus. The room became almost silent. Only the quiet scratching of careful writing remained. Outside, the wind gently stirred the leaves of nearby date palms. Inside, another generation learned the patient art of recording words that might outlive everyone present. The youngest student frowned slightly. A grain of sand had landed upon the wet ink. He looked worried. The teacher smiled. "It happens." He handed the boy another sheet. "There is always another chance." The boy relaxed. He began again. Sometimes the smallest lessons remained longest in memory. As the sun climbed higher, the village gradually slowed. Heavy heat settled across the open ground. Stone walls grew warm beneath the sunlight. The air itself seemed thicker. People naturally adjusted their pace. No one walked quickly unless there was real need. Builders rested beneath shaded walls for a few moments before lifting another stone. Potters paused between shaping vessels. Farmers drank cool water beneath palm trees before returning to their fields. The rhythm of work followed the rhythm of the sun. Resisting the heat only created greater exhaustion. Accepting it made each day easier. Inside many homes, midday meals began quietly. Simple bread, fresh onions, beans, dates, sometimes dried fish from the river. Clay cups filled with cool water rested beside woven baskets. Families gathered briefly before returning to their work. Conversations remained gentle. The morning's labor had already begun to tire their bodies. Their voices naturally softened. One elderly grandfather sat near the doorway where a little breeze still found its way inside. His grandson sat beside him, watching tiny streams of sunlight fall across the floor. The child noticed another little pile of sand gathered in one corner. "We swept there this morning," he said. The old man nodded. "The wind remembers every path." The child looked thoughtfully at the small drift. He picked up a handful. The grain slipped slowly through his fingers until only a few remained in his palm. They felt warm now, almost alive beneath the midday sun. His grandfather smiled. "The desert is always traveling." Outside, the Nile continued flowing as it always had. Its cool waters reflected bright sunlight that danced across the gentle current. Boats drifted quietly downstream. Palm trees leaned over the riverbanks. The smell of damp reeds mixed softly with warm earth and sun-baked mud bricks. Far beyond the cultivated land, the endless desert rested beneath the brilliant sky. For now, it appeared peaceful once again. Its winds had grown quiet. Its sand lay still across the hills. Yet everyone living beside the Nile understood that stillness was only another part of the desert's long breathing. Sooner or later, perhaps many days from now, perhaps much sooner, another gentle wind would rise beyond the western horizon. Another slow curtain of pale dust would begin its patient journey toward the green valley. And when that day came, the people would once again cover their bread, secure their boats, brush their doorways, and welcome the familiar visitor with the calm acceptance that countless generations before them had quietly learned beside the timeless waters of the Nile. By the time the sun stood high above the valley, the morning coolness had become only a memory. The air shimmered gently above the fields, and the warm light rested upon every roof, every palm leaf, and every quiet bend of the Nile. The mud brick walls that had felt pleasantly cool before sunrise now held the growing heat. They would continue gathering warmth throughout the afternoon, only slowly giving it back after darkness returned. This was the hour when every movement became slower. Not because the work was less important, but because the sun asked everyone to be patient. The farmers understood this better than anyone. A group of men worked beside one of the larger irrigation canals where water branched into many smaller channels before reaching the fields. The sandstorm had carried fine dust into the shallow ditches, and although much had already been cleared during the morning, little pockets of pale sand still rested wherever the water moved more slowly. One farmer knelt beside the canal. He lowered both hands into the cool water. The feeling brought immediate relief. For a few quiet moments he simply let the current flow between his fingers. The river had traveled a great distance to reach this place. Its coolness felt almost miraculous beneath the fierce sun. Nearby, his younger brother carefully shaped the edge of the canal with a wooden tool. The earth needed gentle repair after each storm. If one side became too low, precious water might escape into the wrong field. If another side became too high, thirsty plants would receive too little. Every handful of soil mattered. Every small adjustment helped protect the coming harvest. The brothers spoke only occasionally. Most of their work happened in comfortable silence. The sounds around them were enough. The quiet splash of water. The soft scrape of wood against damp earth. The distant calls of birds circling above the marshes. The gentle rustle of reeds bending with the breeze. These familiar sounds had accompanied generations of farmers before them. They asked for nothing except patient attention. Not far away, a woman walked carefully along a narrow path carrying a basket balanced upon her head. Inside were fresh onions, a small bundle of herbs, and several warm loaves of bread wrapped in linen. She was bringing the midday meal to her husband and sons working in the fields. The basket felt heavy. She did not hurry. She knew that walking steadily used less energy than rushing beneath the afternoon sun. As she passed through the barley, dragonflies hovered above the irrigation channels. Their delicate wings caught the sunlight like tiny pieces of polished glass. Small frogs rested beneath damp grasses near the water's edge. Occasionally one slipped quietly into the canal with hardly a sound. The woman smiled as she watched them. She had seen these little creatures every summer since childhood. Their presence always reminded her that the Nile gave life not only to people but to every living thing that shared its waters. When she reached the workers, they welcomed her with quiet gratitude. No one spoke immediately. They first washed their hands in the canal before sitting beneath the shade of a date palm. The tree offered only a small circle of coolness, but it was enough. The family shared bread, onions, lentils, and cool water from a clay jar wrapped in damp cloth. The jar had stayed surprisingly cool despite the heat. Tiny drops of moisture covered its outer surface. The youngest son pressed his cheek against it for a moment. Everyone laughed softly. Not loudly. Only enough to brighten the peaceful afternoon. After eating, no one rose immediately. The shade invited a few moments of rest. The father leaned against the rough trunk of the palm. He closed his eyes. The wind moved gently through the long leaves above, creating a quiet whisper that blended with the distant sound of flowing water. It was easy to understand why so many workers treasured these brief pauses. The afternoon would still be waiting. The fields would still need care. But for these few moments, there was only shade, family, and the slow breathing of the land itself. Back in the village, many workshops had also entered their quietest hours. The carpenter placed his tools neatly upon the workbench before stepping outside. His workshop remained open, allowing fresh air to move through the room. Sunlight filtered between wooden beams, forming long patterns across the floor. Tiny grains of dust floated lazily in those golden rays. Nothing disturbed them. The room itself seemed to rest. The potter had finished shaping the day's first collection of bowls. Now they stood in careful rows beneath a shaded shelter where they could dry slowly. Too much direct sunlight could crack fresh clay. Too little warmth would delay the work. Finding the right balance required experience learned over many years. The potter's apprentice sat nearby preparing more clay. He kneaded it with both hands, folding and pressing it over and over again. The movement was calm and rhythmic. Each turn removed tiny pockets of air. Each fold made the clay smoother. His teacher watched without speaking. Good habits were often learned through quiet observation rather than long instruction. Across another narrow street, the village baker prepared dough for tomorrow morning. Many people imagined that bread appeared only when the oven was lit. The baker knew better. Much of the work happened long before sunrise. Flour had to be measured. Water carried from the well. The dough mixed carefully and left to rest. Every loaf began with patience. The baker brushed a little sand from the wooden table before beginning. Although the storm had ended yesterday, fine dust still found its way into every corner. He smiled to himself. Perhaps tomorrow there would be less. Perhaps there would be more. Either way, the bread would still be baked. Outside the workshop, two elderly men sat beneath the shade of a sycamore tree. They no longer spent long days lifting heavy loads as they once had. Instead, they watched the village continue its familiar routines. Children carried water. Farmers crossed the fields. Merchants loaded donkeys. Builders repaired walls. The older men recognized many of these scenes from decades earlier. Only the faces had changed. One man picked up a handful of sand from the ground. He let it slip slowly through his fingers. "When I was a boy," he said quietly, "I thought every storm changed the world." His friend smiled. "And now?" The first man looked toward the river. "Now I think it only reminds us how much stays the same." For a while they said nothing more. The silence between old friends required no filling. The breeze spoke gently enough for everyone. Along the riverbank, a small group of children gathered where the water met the shore. Their mothers washed linen nearby, beating the cloth gently against smooth stones before rinsing it in the clear current. The children floated little bundles of reeds upon the water, pretending they were tiny boats traveling north toward distant cities they had never seen. Each small bundle drifted only a short distance before reaching the reeds along the bank. The children laughed softly and tried again. One little boy carefully shaped a tiny sail from a palm leaf. His sister placed it upon another reed bundle. Together they watched it glide across the quiet water. The river accepted every little boat without judgment. Some floated longer. Some quickly tipped over. All eventually became part of the gentle current. Their mother looked up from her washing and smiled. She remembered playing the same game when she herself had been a child. The river carried memories as faithfully as it carried water. Farther downstream, fishermen returned with the morning's catch. The fish shimmered silver inside woven baskets. Their boats glided smoothly toward the landing place. Waiting families helped lift baskets ashore. Some fish would be cooked that evening. Others would be dried beneath the sun to provide food during later days. Nothing was wasted. Each catch represented long hours of quiet patience upon the river. An elderly woman inspected one basket carefully before selecting several fish for her household. She thanked the fisherman with a warm smile. The exchange required few words. They had known each other for many years. Trust had grown naturally through countless mornings just like this one. As afternoon slowly deepened, the heat settled more heavily across the valley. Even the birds became quieter. Many rested beneath thick leaves or among the tall reeds where shade remained cool. Dogs stretched beneath carts. Cats disappeared beneath stone benches. Goats gathered beneath simple shelters built from branches and woven reeds. The entire village seemed to breathe more slowly. The desert beyond the fields shimmered beneath the sunlight. Its distant hills appeared to dance gently in the warm air. From time to time a small breeze lifted a little dust from the ground. It traveled only a few steps before settling again. Nothing like yesterday's storm. Only a quiet reminder that the desert was never completely still. Inside the scribe's cool room, writing continued without interruption. The thick walls protected him from much of the afternoon heat. He paused only to dip his brush into fresh ink or to stretch his fingers after completing another long list of grain records. A tiny patch of sunlight slowly moved across the floor as the hours passed. Without needing to look outside, he always knew the time by watching that warm square of light. The day itself became his silent companion. Outside, another breeze wandered through the village. It carried the scent of warm bread, damp river reeds, sun-baked earth, and faint traces of desert sand. These were the familiar scents of life beside the Nile. Simple, steady, comforting. They had filled the valley for countless generations, greeting each new day with the same quiet promise that tomorrow, whatever the wind might bring, ordinary life would gently begin again. The afternoon moved slowly across the valley, almost as slowly as the Nile itself. The brightest hours of the day encouraged everyone to measure their strength carefully. There was little value in rushing beneath the heavy sun. The people who had lived beside the river all their lives understood that every task had its proper pace. The land rewarded steady hands more often than hurried ones. The light became softer inside the mud brick homes, where thick walls held back much of the heat. In one small house, a woman sat upon a woven mat grinding grain between two smooth stones. The upper stone fit comfortably into her hands from many years of use. She pushed it forward and drew it back again, slowly crushing the golden kernels into fine flour. The sound was gentle. Stone against stone. Forward. Back. Again. Again. It was a sound heard throughout countless Egyptian villages every single day. The rhythm had become so familiar that many people hardly noticed it anymore. A little girl sat beside her mother, watching the flour gather in a shallow clay bowl. Every now and then the child reached out to brush away a tiny grain of sand that had settled upon the edge of the bowl. Her mother smiled. "You have careful eyes." The little girl looked pleased. She did not yet know how many small tasks required careful eyes. One day she would. The flour would become bread before sunrise. The bread would feed workers in the fields. The workers would tend the crops that became more grain. The quiet circle of daily life continued without needing anyone to speak of it. Outside, the village paths had become nearly empty. Most people remained in whatever shade they could find during the hottest part of the afternoon. Palm trees cast long patches of coolness across the ground. Simple shelters made from woven reeds protected workers resting between their duties. Even the donkeys seemed grateful for every shadow. One gray donkey stood beneath a sycamore tree with its eyes half closed. Its ears twitched now and then to chase away small insects. Otherwise it hardly moved. Nearby, a clay water trough reflected the sunlight. A boy approached carrying two small buckets. He filled the trough carefully before stepping back. The donkey lifted its head and drank slowly. The boy watched quietly. He knew the animal had helped carry grain, clay, and firewood for many months. Looking after it was simply another ordinary responsibility. A cool drink belonged to every hard-working creature. Near the carpenter's workshop, the shade had shifted across the doorway. The carpenter returned to his workbench after resting through the hottest hour. He selected a piece of acacia wood and examined its smooth grain. The wood had dried for many months before becoming ready for use. Good wood required patience before it ever reached a craftsman's hands. He measured it with a simple cord. Then he marked a careful line using charcoal. Each cut followed slowly. The bronze blade moved with quiet confidence. Thin curls of pale wood fell onto the floor. The familiar scent of fresh timber filled the room. It mixed gently with the smell of warm earth drifting through the open doorway. His young apprentice gathered the wood shavings into a basket. Nothing useful was wasted. The smallest pieces would later help light cooking fires. The larger scraps might become handles for tools or children's toys. The carpenter often reminded his apprentice that every piece of wood had its own purpose. The boy listened carefully. He enjoyed learning lessons hidden inside ordinary work. Across the village, the potter had begun preparing his kiln. Yesterday's storm had left a fine coating of dust upon its rounded surface. He brushed it away before stacking dried bowls inside. Each vessel rested upon another with careful spacing. Too close together, and they might crack. Too far apart, and precious space would be wasted. Years of experience guided his hands. When everything had been arranged, he stepped back and looked quietly at his work. The firing would wait until evening, when the air became cooler. Clay responded better to patient timing than hurried plans. Farther down the lane, an elderly woman sat weaving linen thread into a length of cloth. The loom stood beneath the covered porch of her home. Its wooden frame cast delicate shadows across the ground. She passed the thread carefully from one side to the other. Each movement seemed almost effortless. Her hands remembered what her thoughts no longer needed to direct. The cloth slowly grew. Only a finger's width during the last hour. Yet she smiled with quiet satisfaction. Many worthwhile things grew slowly. The finest cloth. The strongest friendships. The tallest date palms. Even children. None of them hurried. Beyond the village, the fields shimmered beneath the afternoon light. A farmer walked along the edge of one irrigation canal carrying a simple wooden rake. He stopped every few steps to clear drifting weeds or straighten the small ridges guiding water toward the crops. His sandals pressed gently into the damp earth. Each footprint filled slowly with a little water before disappearing altogether. He noticed this often. The earth remembered every step only for a little while. Then the water quietly smoothed everything once again. He found comfort in that simple thought. Nearby, his daughter gathered bundles of reeds growing along the canal. The reeds would later be dried and used for making baskets, sleeping mats, or repairing roofs. She selected each one carefully. Only the strongest stems belonged in her bundle. Her father had taught her not to rush this work. A weak reed hidden among strong ones could weaken an entire basket. The lesson reached beyond basket making. She would understand that more clearly as she grew older. The afternoon breeze became a little stronger. Not enough to trouble anyone. Just enough to stir the tops of the barley. The fields moved together like gentle waves upon the river. Thousands of slender stalks bent in the same direction. Then slowly stood upright again. A few tiny grains of yesterday's sand lifted into the air before settling once more. The storm had passed. Its memory remained only in little traces scattered across the valley. Along the riverbank, several fishermen repaired an old wooden boat. Years of steady use had loosened some of its joints. One man heated a mixture of resin over a small fire. Another pressed fresh fibers into the narrow seams between the wooden planks. The work demanded steady hands. If even one gap remained open, water would slowly find its way inside. The oldest fisherman inspected every repair before nodding quietly. His approval came with few words. The younger men understood that silence often meant the work had been done well. Nearby, children collected smooth stones from the river's edge. Some stones would become grinding tools. Others might support cooking pots above small fires. A little boy held up one especially round stone to his grandmother. She turned it over in her hands. "It has traveled a long way," she said. The boy looked toward the flowing river. "From where?" She smiled gently. "Perhaps from a place neither of us will ever see." The boy imagined distant lands far beyond the southern horizon where the Nile began its endless journey. The thought filled him with quiet wonder. He placed the stone carefully into his basket. The sun had started its slow journey toward the western sky. The harsh brightness of midday softened little by little. Longer shadows stretched across the fields. The palm trees reached farther across the earth. Workers noticed the change without looking directly at the sun. The land itself seemed to relax. More people returned to their tasks. Builders carried fresh mud to repair walls cracked by months of heat. The mixture of clay, straw, and water felt cool beneath their hands. One builder smoothed the wet surface with a flat wooden board. The wall gradually became even again. Tomorrow it would dry beneath the sun. In time it would become as hard as the older bricks surrounding it. Mud brick homes always required care. Every season left its own marks. Heavy rains, though rare, softened corners. Hot summers opened small cracks. Sandstorms polished rough edges. Families accepted these changes just as they accepted the changing river. A home was never truly finished. It simply continued growing stronger through constant attention. In the marketplace, merchants slowly reopened the woven coverings protecting their goods. Bright vegetables rested in shallow baskets. Fresh dates glowed warmly beneath the afternoon light. Bundles of garlic hung from wooden beams. Clay jars filled with oil stood neatly arranged along shaded walls. Customers arrived one by one. No crowd gathered. There was no loud bargaining. Only quiet conversations between neighbors who knew one another well. An old merchant carefully wiped a thin layer of dust from his measuring scales before weighing grain for a young mother. She thanked him with a warm smile. The exchange felt almost ceremonial after so many years of familiar routine. Nearby, the scent of fresh bread drifted once again through the market. The baker had removed another batch from the oven. Golden loaves cooled upon woven trays. Their warm aroma mixed with the sweetness of ripe figs and the faint earthy smell left behind by yesterday's storm. People passing by slowed almost without realizing it. The smell reminded them that evening was slowly approaching. Before long, families would gather once more inside their homes. Cooking fires would glow. Stories would be shared. The day's tired muscles would finally rest. For now, however, the village continued its peaceful rhythm beneath the gentle afternoon sun, while beyond the green valley the quiet desert waited in patient silence, watching over the land as it had for countless generations, never hurried, never truly still, always breathing softly beside the timeless waters of the Nile. The afternoon slowly began its quiet journey toward evening. The change was so gentle that no one noticed it all at once. The sunlight remained warm, but it no longer pressed quite so heavily upon the valley. A faint coolness drifted from the Nile, almost hidden beneath the lingering warmth of the day. People who had rested during the hottest hours gradually returned to their work. The village seemed to awaken for a second time. Along one narrow street, a woman stepped outside carrying a woven basket filled with freshly washed linen. She climbed the short mud brick steps leading to her roof, where a soft breeze moved more freely than it did below. She unfolded each piece of cloth with careful hands. Long white garments. Simple head coverings. Small linen towels. She shook each one gently before laying it flat beneath the afternoon sun. Tiny grains of sand floated away with every movement. The storm had passed yesterday, yet the desert still left quiet reminders in the folds of every fabric. She smiled as she worked. There was something comforting about caring for familiar things. The linen would dry before sunset. Tomorrow morning someone in the family would wear each piece without giving another thought to the patient hands that had cleaned it. Across the lane, an elderly man slowly climbed onto his own roof carrying a small clay jar and a reed brush. His roof collected more sand than most because his home stood near the western edge of the village. He looked over the flat surface with calm eyes. Small drifts rested beside the low parapet. The wind had arranged them into delicate curves during the night. For a moment he simply admired the patterns. The desert had shaped them with no hands at all. Then he began sweeping. Each slow stroke pushed another little stream of pale sand toward the edge. It slipped quietly into the street below. He had repeated this task so many times that the movements felt almost like breathing. Nothing about it seemed tiring. It was simply part of living where river and desert met each other every day. Nearby, a pair of sisters gathered dry palm leaves that had fallen after the storm. The leaves would not be wasted. Some would become fuel for cooking fires. Others would be woven into simple baskets or used to repair roof coverings before the next rainy season. The older sister examined every leaf carefully. She separated the strongest from those already too brittle. The younger girl copied her without needing many words. Learning often happened through watching. The oldest lessons rarely required long explanations. At the edge of the village, where cultivated fields slowly gave way to open desert, a shepherd watched over a small flock of goats. The animals wandered among patches of hardy shrubs that somehow managed to survive in the dry soil. Every so often one goat stopped to nibble at a thorny branch. Another searched beneath a flat stone where a few stubborn plants still grew. The shepherd leaned upon his wooden staff. He looked toward the western horizon. Yesterday a pale wall of blowing sand had appeared there. Today the sky stretched clear and quiet. Only a faint haze remained far in the distance. The desert seemed peaceful again. He knew appearances could change quickly. Still, there was comfort in clear skies. A gentle breeze passed across the open land. It carried the warm smell of sunlit stone and dry earth. The shepherd closed his eyes for a moment. He could hear the quiet chewing of the goats, the distant calls of birds near the river, the faint rustling of grass moving together in the wind. Nothing more. Sometimes the simplest sounds made the deepest silence feel complete. Back in the village, the potter finally prepared to light his kiln. He had waited patiently until the strongest heat of the afternoon had begun to soften. Carefully arranged inside were bowls, jars, cups, and small storage vessels shaped during the past several days. Each one represented many quiet hours at the wheel. His apprentice handed him bundles of dry reeds. The fire began with only a few small flames. Thin gray smoke rose gently into the still air. Little by little the fire grew warmer. The potter watched closely. Too much heat too quickly could ruin an entire week's work. He adjusted the fuel carefully. The fire answered with a soft crackling sound. Its warmth spread slowly through the kiln walls. The apprentice sat nearby, fascinated as always. The transformation still felt magical to him. Soft clay would become hard enough to hold water. Fragile shapes would become strong enough to serve families for many years. His teacher simply smiled. Years of practice had replaced wonder with quiet respect. He still appreciated the process. He simply understood it better. Not far away, the village baker removed another batch of flat bread from the oven. The warm loaves rested upon woven trays, sending their comforting aroma through nearby streets. Children passing by slowed their steps. The smell made them smile. One little boy looked hopefully toward the baker. The baker laughed softly and handed him a small piece of bread still warm from the oven. The boy thanked him politely before running home. His footsteps disappeared around the corner. The baker returned to his work. Small moments of kindness were as ordinary as baking itself. No one spoke of them afterward. They simply became part of another peaceful day. Along the Nile, fishermen prepared for the evening hours. Many preferred casting their nets as the light began to fade. The river often became especially calm then. Fish moved quietly beneath the cooling water. One fisherman untied the rope securing his narrow boat. His daughter steadied the vessel while he climbed aboard. She had helped him many evenings before. Without speaking, she handed him the rolled fishing net. He placed it carefully beside the seat. The familiar routine required no discussion. Everything happened naturally. The boat drifted gently away from shore. Its reflection stretched across the water before slowly breaking apart among the ripples. Other boats followed one by one. Soon several small vessels moved quietly across the broad river, their shapes growing smaller beneath the afternoon sky. Near the riverbank, women continued washing clothes. The work had become easier now that the sun no longer stood directly overhead. Freshly cleaned linen fluttered gently upon ropes stretched between wooden posts. Tiny drops of water sparkled briefly before disappearing into the warm air. A grandmother carefully folded garments already dry. She stacked them neatly inside a large woven basket. Beside her sat her granddaughter, carefully learning the same task. The older woman showed her how to smooth each fold with gentle hands. Wrinkles would disappear more easily that way. The child watched closely. Then she tried herself. Her first fold looked uneven. She frowned. The grandmother quietly unfolded it and smiled. Again. The girl nodded. The second attempt looked much better. Neither hurried. Some lessons were meant to arrive slowly. Across the fields, the farmers inspected their crops one final time before evening. The barley swayed gently. The onions stood straight. The flax shimmered softly beneath the lowering sun. Yesterday's sandstorm already seemed farther away. The plants had endured. The water still flowed. The land continued offering its quiet promise of another harvest. One elderly farmer paused beside an irrigation canal. He dipped a small clay cup into the flowing water. After drinking, he looked toward the western desert. The sand there glowed softly beneath the afternoon light. Golden hills stretched beyond sight. They appeared peaceful. Almost gentle. He knew better than to mistake calm for permanence. The desert changed without asking permission. Yet he held no anger toward it. The wind had shaped his father's life. It had shaped his own. One day it would shape his grandchildren's lives as well. Living beside the Nile meant sharing the land with both fertile water and wandering sand. Neither could be separated from the other. As the shadows slowly lengthened, birds became more active once again. White egrets glided low across the marshes. Swallows darted through the air chasing insects above the fields. A pair of ibises landed near the river's edge, their long curved beaks searching patiently through the damp soil. Their quiet movements matched the gentle pace of the evening. The village itself seemed to breathe more deeply. Workers finished their final tasks. Builders covered fresh mud walls with woven mats to protect them overnight. Carpenters placed their tools neatly inside wooden chests. Potters watched the steady warmth of their kilns. Merchants counted the day's remaining goods before lowering woven coverings across their stalls. Nothing ended suddenly. Every task gently gave way to the next. The sun continued its slow descent toward the western horizon. Its light turned warmer with every passing moment. Mud brick homes glowed softly. Palm trunks shone with rich golden color. The Nile reflected long ribbons of orange and pale bronze. Even the fresh sand left behind by the storm seemed to catch the light with quiet beauty. No one stood still simply to admire it. Yet everyone carried the evening within them. They felt the day relaxing. They felt the valley growing quieter. Soon cooking fires would begin sending thin streams of smoke into the calm sky. Families would gather inside cool homes. The scent of bread, lentils, herbs, and onions would once again drip through the peaceful streets. And somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the palm groves, beyond the winding river, the great desert would remain silent beneath the fading sunlight, resting for another night while the people of ancient Egypt continued their gentle lives beside the patient waters of the Nile. The sun drifted lower across the western sky, and the long afternoon slowly gave itself to evening. The bright light that had covered the valley for so many hours softened into warm shades of amber and gold. Every mud brick wall seemed to glow gently. Palm trees stretched long shadows across the fields, and the quiet waters of the Nile reflected the changing colors with slow, graceful movements. The heat no longer pressed so heavily upon the land. A welcome breeze wandered through the village. It carried the scent of damp river reeds, warm earth, fresh bread, and the faint sweetness of flowering plants growing beside irrigation canals. People noticed the cooler air without speaking of it. Their shoulders relaxed. Their steps became lighter. After a long day beneath the sun, evening always felt like an old friend returning. One farmer stood at the edge of his barley field, leaning comfortably upon his wooden hoe. He looked across the rows of grain that shimmered softly beneath the fading light. Yesterday's sandstorm had left a thin layer of pale dust across many of the leaves, yet the plants had already begun to look fresh again. The morning's careful watering had washed much of the sand down into the soil. Nature often repaired itself quietly. The farmer bent down and gently ran his fingers across one healthy stalk. Its leaves felt cool now. The rough warmth of midday had disappeared. He smiled with quiet satisfaction. The field would need more care tomorrow. There was always more work waiting. But for this evening, everything seemed peaceful. His eldest son walked slowly beside him carrying an empty basket. Together they made their way toward home. Neither hurried. The road would still be there if they walked slowly. The village would still be waiting. A pair of white egrets lifted gracefully from the irrigation canal as they passed. The birds circled once above the field before gliding toward the river. The father watched them disappear into the evening sky. "I have seen those birds every season since I was your age," he said softly. His son looked upward. "They always return." The farmer nodded. "As long as the river flows." The two continued walking. Their sandals left gentle prints in the soft earth. Behind them, the irrigation water continued its patient journey through narrow channels toward waiting crops. Nearby, women gathered bundles of fresh herbs planted close to the water. The cooler evening air made the work pleasant. One woman clipped fragrant mint while another carefully gathered coriander leaves. The herbs would flavor the evening meal. Their fresh scent filled the air each time another handful entered a woven basket. A little girl followed beside her mother. She carried only a very small basket. Still, she walked with great seriousness. Each leaf she picked seemed important. Every herb she gathered made her feel helpful. When her basket finally held enough, she looked proudly toward her mother. The woman smiled warmly. "You have gathered enough for all of us." The child beamed with quiet happiness. Simple praise stayed in the heart for a long time. Back in the village, the marketplace slowly entered its busiest hour of the evening. Families stopped on their way home to collect whatever they still needed before nightfall. Merchants greeted familiar faces with gentle smiles. The conversations were calm. No one seemed rushed. Clay lamps had not yet been lit. There was still enough sunlight to finish the day's trading. A merchant selling woven baskets carefully brushed away a little sand that had gathered beneath his display. He arranged the baskets once more. Large ones for storing grain. Medium baskets for vegetables. Small baskets for carrying herbs or fruit. His fingers moved lovingly across each woven surface. Every basket represented many hours of careful work. Nearby, a woman examined a new water jar made by the village potter. She turned it slowly in her hands. Its smooth surface reflected the warm evening light. She smiled with approval. The potter noticed. He smiled back. No long discussion was needed. She carried the jar home carefully balanced against her shoulder. Inside another workshop, the carpenter finished smoothing the edge of a wooden stool. He brushed away the last curls of fresh wood. The surface felt perfectly smooth beneath his fingertips. He placed the stool beside several finished pieces waiting to be collected. Tomorrow another family would place it inside their home. Perhaps an elderly grandfather would sit upon it while telling stories. Perhaps a mother would use it while grinding grain. The carpenter liked imagining where his work might travel. Every object eventually became part of someone's daily life. That thought brought quiet satisfaction. Not far away, the potter checked the warmth of his kiln. The fire glowed steadily behind the small opening. He added another careful bundle of dry reeds. The flames answered with a gentle crackling sound. His apprentice watched the glowing firelight dancing across the clay walls. The older man spoke softly. "Clay teaches patience." The apprentice nodded. He had heard those words many times. Only now did he begin to understand them. Nothing beautiful could be hurried. The evening breeze drifted through the village. Children returned from helping in the fields. Their feet carried dust from many different paths. Some had gathered reeds. Others had watched goats. A few had spent the afternoon carrying water for older relatives. Now they gathered together in the open courtyard near several date palms. Their games were quieter than they had been in the cool morning. The day's work had left them pleasantly tired. One group drew simple shapes into the soft sand using small sticks. Another carefully stacked smooth stones collected beside the Nile. The youngest children watched tiny ants carrying crumbs far larger than themselves. Everything became interesting when evening slowed the world. An elderly storyteller sat nearby beneath the shade of a broad sycamore tree. He had no audience yet. He simply watched the children. Eventually, one little boy wandered over. Then another. Soon several children sat quietly around him. The old man smiled. Without raising his voice, he began telling a familiar story about a fisherman who always greeted the Nile each morning before casting his nets. His words moved gently. There were no frightening moments. No loud adventures. Only quiet lessons about patience, kindness, and respecting the river that gave life to the valley. Even a passing breeze seemed to pause and listen. Across the village, smoke began rising from cooking fires. Thin gray ribbons drifted lazily into the evening sky. The smell of roasting onions mixed with warm bread, lentils, beans, garlic, and herbs freshly gathered from the gardens. Families prepared simple meals using recipes handed down through many generations. Inside one home, a mother stirred a clay pot while her daughter kneaded fresh dough beside her. The room glowed softly in the fading sunlight entering through the doorway. Tiny grains of yesterday's sand still rested upon the window sill. The mother noticed them. She smiled quietly. Tomorrow morning she would wipe them away again. There was no reason to do it now. Evening belonged to family. The father returned home carrying a bundle of reeds gathered along the river. He leaned them carefully against the wall. They would later become repairs for a sleeping mat. His wife handed him a clay cup filled with cool water. He drank slowly. The water tasted fresh after the long day. For a few moments no one spoke. The peaceful silence itself felt welcoming. Nearby, the grandmother arranged small oil lamps around the room. She trimmed each wick carefully before lighting the first one. A warm golden glow spread across the walls. Shadows moved gently with every flicker of the flame. The room suddenly felt even more peaceful. Outside, the village gradually became quieter. Merchants closed their stalls. Builders stacked unused tools beside unfinished walls. Fishermen returned one by one from the river, their boats moving silently through the calm evening water. Some carried good catches. Others carried only a few fish. Their expressions changed little either way. Tomorrow would bring another chance. The Nile always offered another morning. Along the riverbank, the last sunlight rested upon the gentle current. The water turned deep gold before slowly changing to copper, then to soft shades of purple as the sun slipped closer to the horizon. Reeds swayed quietly. A turtle rested upon a smooth stone warmed by the day's heat. Small fish disturbed the surface now and then, leaving circles that slowly widened before disappearing. Everything happened without hurry. The desert beyond the western fields also changed with the evening light. The pale sand became rich shades of amber and rose. Long shadows filled the valleys between distant dunes. The land that had sent yesterday's storm now looked completely peaceful. Its silence stretched farther than anyone could see. Somewhere beyond those distant hills, the wind was already resting. Perhaps it would remain quiet for many days. Perhaps only until tomorrow. No one could know. The people beside the Nile had long ago stopped asking the desert to explain itself. Instead, they accepted its changing moods with calm hearts. As twilight gently settled over the valley, the first evening stars slowly appeared above the eastern sky. One by one they emerged, brighter now that the dusty air had fully settled. Children pointed upward. Parents smiled. Grandparents remembered countless evenings spent beneath those same stars. The sky seemed timeless. The river flowed steadily below. The warm air carried the scent of bread and river water. The last birds crossed overhead toward their sleeping places among the reeds. The village exhaled together, letting the labors of the day gently drift away with the fading light, while the peaceful Nile continued its endless journey through the quiet heart of ancient Egypt. Night settled softly over the Nile Valley. The last glow of sunset slowly faded from the western horizon, leaving behind a sky filled with quiet stars. Their gentle light reflected across the calm waters of the Nile, where small ripples carried silver patterns toward the north. The village had grown still. Cooking fires had become glowing embers. Clay lamps burned with small, peaceful flames inside mud brick homes. The day's tools rested where careful hands had placed them. Fishing nets hung drying in the cool night air. Fresh bread waited beneath woven cloth for the coming morning. The reed brooms leaned quietly against familiar walls, ready to greet another sunrise whenever it arrived. Far beyond the green fields, the great desert rested beneath the moon. Its endless dunes appeared smooth and gentle, washed in pale light. The wind, which had carried so much sand across the valley, had finally become quiet. It no longer whispered through the streets. It no longer brushed softly against the doorways. For tonight, it simply slept beneath the white Egyptian sky. Along the riverbank, reeds moved only enough to follow the slow breathing of the evening breeze. Frogs called gently from the marshes. A night bird crossed silently above the water before disappearing into the darkness. The Nile flowed on, just as it always had, asking nothing from those who lived beside it except patience and care. Inside their homes, families rested after another ordinary day. Farmers who had tended the fields lay peacefully upon woven mats. Builders who had lifted heavy stones let tired muscles finally grow still. Scribes who had filled rolls of papyrus with careful writing closed their eyes after long hours of quiet work. Fishermen dreamed of calm waters beneath the morning sun. Children, worn happily by simple chores and gentle play, slept deeply beneath linen blankets while grandparents rested nearby, listening to the familiar silence that comes only after a day well lived. Tomorrow, the first birds would greet the dawn. Someone would light the baker's oven before sunrise. Someone would carry water from the well. Someone would sweep a doorway, knead fresh dough, untie a fishing boat, or guide water into waiting fields. Life beside the Nile would begin again with the same peaceful rhythm that had carried countless generations through the passing seasons. The river would continue its endless journey. The palms would sway with the changing breeze. The desert would wait beyond the fertile valley, sometimes silent, sometimes sending another gentle curtain of sand across the land. And the people, with calm hearts and patient hands, would continue meeting each new day exactly as those before them had done. In the quiet meeting place between river and desert, they found not perfect comfort, but a steady one. A comfort built from familiar routines. From warm bread shared at sunset. From cool water drawn each morning. From sandals upon dusty paths. From gentle voices inside humble homes. From work completed with care. From rest honestly earned. Now the village grows quieter still. The lamps burn lower. The stars shine a little brighter. The breeze cools the warm earth left by the day's sun. The Nile whispers softly as it slips through the sleeping valley, carrying moonlight upon its gentle current. There is nothing more to do tonight. The fields can rest. The workshops can rest. The boats can rest. The village can rest. Even the patient desert rests beneath the same peaceful sky. So let your thoughts become as calm as the quiet river. Let them drift as gently as the evening breeze through the palm leaves. Let the day's worries settle like soft grains of sand, finding their own peaceful place upon the earth. And as the ancient night stretches quietly across the timeless waters of the Nile, may sleep